In a small town nestled between rolling hills and fields stood an old brick high school. It was a place where tradition ran deep, and the faces in the classrooms had rarely changed over the years. The school had a reputation for excellence, but beneath the surface there were whispers of something darker, a sense that not everyone was treated equally. Mrs. Penrose was the kind of teacher who believed in tough love. She was strict, demanding, and had little patience for those who didn't meet her high standards. Her English class was notorious for being the most challenging in the school, and she took pride in that reputation. In her class sat Malcolm, a quiet, diligent black student who had transferred to the school a year ago. Malcolm was shy, often keeping to himself, but his essays were insightful, and his love for literature was undeniable. However, Mrs. Penrose didn't see Malcolm's potential. All she saw was a student who didn't fit her image of success. One crisp autumn morning, the class was assigned to write an essay on the theme of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird. Malcolm poured his heart into the assignment, weaving together themes of racial injustice, moral courage, and empathy. When he handed in his essay, he felt a rare sense of pride. A week later, Mrs. Penrose stood at the front of the classroom, holding a stack of graded essays. Her expression was stern as she began handing them back. When she reached Malcolm's desk, she hesitated, then slapped his paper down in front of him, face up, for the entire class to see. In bold red letters across the top of the page was a large D. "This," Mrs. Penrose announced to the class, "is what happens when you don't put in the effort. Malcolm, I expected better from you. This essay is full of cliches and lacks depth." The room fell silent. Malcolm's face burned with humiliation. He stared at the paper, unable to speak, his hands trembling. The students around him glanced at each other, some smirking, others avoiding his gaze. Mrs. Penrose moved on, oblivious to the impact of her words. As the weeks passed, Malcolm's spirit seemed to wither. He stopped participating in class, his essays became shorter, and he rarely made eye contact with anyone, but no one seemed to notice, except for one person. Amelia, another student in the class, had always admired Malcolm's quiet determination. She was one of the few who had read his essay before it was graded, and she knew it was far better than Mrs. Penrose had claimed. Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. One day after school, Amelia found Malcolm sitting alone under a tree, his notebook open but untouched. She sat down beside him, hesitant at first, but determined to reach out. "Malcolm," she began softly, "I read your essay before Mrs. Penrose graded it. I thought it was really powerful." Malcolm looked up, surprised by her words. "Thanks, but it doesn't matter. She's the teacher. She knows better, right?" "Maybe she's wrong," Amelia said firmly. "You have a voice that needs to be heard. Don't let one person's opinion silence you." Malcolm's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away. "It's not just about the essay. It's everything. I feel like no matter what I do, I'm never going to be good enough for someone like her." Amelia's heart ached for him. She realized that this wasn't just about a grade. It was about something much deeper. "You are good enough, Malcolm, and I think it's time someone stood up and said so." The next day, Amelia made a bold decision. She gathered a group of students who felt the same way she did, and they all agreed to approach the principal together. They spoke about the incident in class, how they felt Mrs. Penrose's actions were unfair and damaging, and how they believed Malcolm deserved an apology. The principal, Mr. Hawkins, was a fair man who took their concerns seriously. He called Mrs. Penrose into his office and asked her to explain the situation. At first she was defensive, insisting that she had simply been doing her job. But as Mr. Hawkins pressed her, she began to realize the gravity of her mistake. Reluctantly, Mrs. Penrose agreed to address the class and offer an apology to Malcolm. Standing in front of her students, she felt a rare sense of vulnerability. "I want to apologize," she began, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I was wrong in the way I handled Malcolm's essay. I allowed my own biases to cloud my judgment, and for that, I am truly sorry." Malcolm, sitting in the back of the room, felt a mixture of emotions: anger, relief, and a lingering sadness. The apology was a start, but the damage had already been done. He knew it would take time to rebuild his confidence, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The support of his classmates, especially Amelia, gave him hope. In the days that followed, a change began to ripple through the school. Conversations about fairness, equality, and respect became more common. Students and teachers alike started to reflect on their own actions and attitudes. Mrs. Penrose, once seen as infallible, became a symbol of the need for humility and growth. And Malcolm, though scarred by the experience, found strength in his voice. He continued to write, his words now carrying the weight of someone who had lived through injustice and come out the other side stronger. The lesson was clear. True justice is not just about punishment or reward. It's about recognizing the humanity in others and understanding that our words and actions have the power to lift someone up or tear them down. In the end, the consequences of Mrs. Penrose's mistake were indeed severe, but they also sparked a change that would resonate far beyond the walls of the classroom. As the weeks turned into months, Malcolm's confidence slowly began to rebuild, but the sting of that public humiliation never fully faded. He spent more time in the library, poring over books, finding solace in stories of others who had faced adversity. Amelia often joined him, the two of them forming a quiet, unspoken bond. One day, as the school year was coming to a close, an announcement came over the intercom. The annual writing competition was open for submissions. Malcolm hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The thought of putting himself out there again, of risking another blow to his self-esteem, made his stomach twist. But Amelia's words echoed in his mind. You have a voice that needs to be heard. After days of contemplation, Malcolm decided to submit a piece, but this time it wasn't a typical essay. It was a personal narrative, an honest, raw account of his experience with Mrs. Penrose, his struggles with self-worth and the importance of standing up for what's right. He titled it, The Silence That Speaks. The day of the award ceremony arrived, and the entire school gathered in the auditorium. Malcolm sat near the back, his heart pounding. He told himself it didn't matter if he won. Just entering was a victory in itself. As the names of the winners were called, Malcolm's mind began to wander, his thoughts drifting to all the times he had doubted himself, to the moments of pain and resilience. Suddenly, his name was announced. First place, The Silence That Speaks by Malcolm Davis. Stunned, Malcolm walked to the stage, the applause around him a distant hum. He accepted the award with trembling hands, his mind racing. As he looked out at the sea of faces, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about a win. This was about reclaiming his dignity, his voice, his sense of self. When the applause died down, the principal, Mr. Hawkins, took the microphone. Malcolm, your essay was powerful, moving, and important. It reminded us all of the impact we have on each other's lives. Would you be willing to read an excerpt for us? Malcolm hesitated, but then nodded. He stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and began to read. I was taught that silence is golden, but sometimes silence speaks louder than words. It can echo through the halls of a school, into the hearts of students, leaving a mark that is not easily erased. Silence can be a weapon, a shield, or a way to hide. But silence, when broken, has the power to change everything. As he read, the room grew silent. Not the oppressive silence of before, but one of reverence and reflection. When he finished, there was a moment of stillness before the room erupted in applause, louder and more heartfelt than before. Mrs. Penrose, sitting in the front row, felt a lump in her throat. She had never imagined the impact her words had on Malcolm. In that moment, she realized the full weight of her actions, not just the mistake she made, but the strength it took for Malcolm to rise above it. After the ceremony, she approached him, her eyes filled with remorse. Malcolm, I don't have the words to fully express how sorry I am. You've taught me more than I ever taught you. Thank you for your courage. Malcolm looked at her, the bitterness in his heart softened by her sincerity. We all make mistakes, Mrs. Penrose. What matters is what we do after. I'm glad I didn't stay silent. As they stood there, a sense of closure washed over Malcolm. He knew this was not just an ending, but a beginning, a new chapter in his life where his voice would never be silenced again. He had faced the worst and emerged stronger, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. And so, the story of Malcolm Davis became a lesson not just in the importance of speaking up, but in the power of forgiveness, resilience, and the profound impact of understanding and empathy. The small-town school would never be the same, and neither would Malcolm.